Hello, welcome to the tutorial of DrawTerrain version 2. I'm very happy to be releasing this update. It's very big compared to the version 1, and we are going to go through quickly how it works, even what's already included in version 1, and all of the new features that were added. I will start by showing you how to install it because I get a lot of questions. DrawTerrain is an asset library, so you don't install it via the add-ons, you install it in the file path. And basically the only thing that you need once you downloaded it, you can unzip the DrawTerrain folder in your library, wherever it is, and then point to that folder DrawTerrain in your asset library. And once this is done, when you go into your asset browser, DrawTerrain, you will see all of this and with this organization. So going quickly into the different sections, DrawTerrain version 2 is what you will use all the time. That's what you need to apply on any planes that you will work on and use. And that is what is applied on any presets. So here the presets, I separated them in categories. It's just a guideline, it can be anything, but just to give you a starting point and an idea of what they look like. Then here you have the splat map. These are used to mainly give you options, access to the different info map of the different styles, the alpine, canyons, dunes, hills, which are used in there. With this you can extract the information of erosion, flow, soil, and the overall height map. And here are the gradients. It's just giving you tools, but these color ramps set up and they allow you to give this type of results when combined with all of the info map that are here and that are integrated in these node groups, which these node groups again are exactly like that. All of them are the same. The only difference is the height map used here that determine the style of your mountain. So let's start from scratch what you would have to do to set up your first terrain if you don't use any presets. So first, create a plane that you can scale depending on the size of the terrain you need. Let's apply the scale to have a scale of 1. It's not necessary, but it's always cleaner. Then in the modifier, once you install DrawTerrain as a library, you can find here DrawTerrain, and now it is applied. So I suggest starting with a base subdivision of 3 if you didn't pre-subdivide your terrain. So if it's basically one big polygon. If you pre-subdivide it because you want to sculpt it beforehand or for any other reason, you can leave the base subdivision to 0. Now the second step is to add a curve. I'm just scaling the basic curve, but you can also use this tool to draw one. Be careful when you draw any curve. If there is any leftover points that are twisted like this, or sometimes could be like that, it's gonna mess up with the calculation. Usually it's nicer to just clean up. And the less point you have, the easier it is to control the curve afterwards. So now you just need to reference the curve in the modifier, and you start having your terrain. Going slowly step by step on all of the settings. So we have the base subdivision. Why do I have a base subdivision and here adaptive subdivision? It's basically for optimization purposes. If I put on the wireframe, you can see that the base subdivision is going to determine the biggest polygon and the size when they are not affected by the curve. But you need a minimum of it to start pick up information from the curve. So 2 is the bare minimum, but 3 is a really good start and still very low poly. And afterwards you can add more subdivision levels here. What it will do is add smaller polygons the closer to the curve, which is in general the silhouette of your terrain, and it's what matters in terms of details. With the subdivision threshold, you can expand and have your subdivision go lower and further from the curve. It helps if you want to have a bit more details on the slanted areas rather than just on the peak. If I add one more, you can see the effect it has. And of course it is optimized, but the more you add, the slower it will be. Then the curve index only matters if you stack the modifier. So add another DrawTerrain modifier on top of this one. So if I add a DrawTerrain modifier on top, now it is important for the mapping to have a different curve index. And now if I duplicate this curve, I have the second one. So the way it works, it adds to the subdivision, so be careful to remove the base subdivision you have here and not necessarily have too many here as well. The calculation for the second modifier adds to the first one. It doesn't override it. So you can see if I go below, it starts removing, and if I go above, it adds, even if the curve is relatively flat. One advantage is if you want to draw roads, for example, you can have it flat from the top, and then the details will add to the already existing terrain. So for example, if I insert my second curve a bit, I reduce the spread to make it very small. Oh no, that's the wrong one. This is the main one, let's leave it at 50 for now. So if I reduce the second one, now you can see that it's displacing corresponding to the existing terrain. And then you need to balance a bit your subdivision to make sure you have enough details. Sometimes increasing the resolution of the curve here can help the algorithm pick up more details, but it is a matter of fiddling a bit and finding what works the best. For example here, reducing the adaptive subdivision on the main shape and adding a base subdivision helps in these areas where there is not enough polygons. Now going into the rest of the settings, there is delete unused geometry, which removes what is not affected by the curve. It's very useful if you want to have an asset that you want to place in different areas of your illustration or your landscape. Like this, you don't need to deal with hiding the rest of the plane. And you can expand or retract the outer part depending on what you need. If you need a soft transition or if you really just need that part. The spread is basically how wide your mountain or your terrain is going to be. The top plateau is creating a plateau on the top, which can also be the bottom if you are below. Basically, it's the place the closest to the curve. And I greatly improved it from version 1. It works nicer, it distorts way less the geometry, and now it allows the UV to be stretched to keep something consistent compared to what we used to have before. Peak smooth is going to smooth mostly the top part and the peaks, but is not affecting the noise strength, for example, which is used to give detail and uneven aspect to the silhouette of your terrain. It's great to really break the CG effect and look that you can have, and you can control how high and how low the noise goes, isolating it to the toppest part or going all the way down. A seed, of course, basic noise settings that you can control. Another feature is the chaos, which is going to displace your curve and give the effect of a more chaotic mountain features. So if I remove the peak smooth, you can have something very intense, or you can have something less. Here, the three different values, x, y, and z, affect how the curve is displaced. If you put 0 on z, it will not affect vertically the curve, but if you start adding, it will add chaos on the z direction. Having it to 0 is great because you can just have this type of broken ridges, and then you can increase the vector and start having something way more chaotic, but that looks way more natural in some instances. The size of the noise and the seed can help you give more random results and happy accidents. On top of that, you can shape your terrain with the curvature, giving it a more steep look, way more eroded or more bulbous. And if you go too low, it will start breaking like that, basically removing the fall off of the spread. But it could be interesting in some instances to create some weird effect on terrains. Same happy accidents. From the version 2, I added what I used to do as a trick before. So it's the ability to tilt the displacement on the X and Y axis. What's really cool about this, even if it's less visually accurate compared to the curve, is that you can get these slanted terrains now, which you couldn't get before. You can get very dynamic terrains without having to go crazy about it. The auto smooth angle is basically the smoothing of the polygons. It can help if you want to have something more stylized, and if you're working with lower geometry, to have a low poly look sometime and then some hard breaks, which can be really cool if you work on some low poly look terrains. And it's also the absolute most performant you could be. A trick that I realize is not really known is when you work with values, you don't have, for example, here to slide them one by one. You can click and drag down to select different values at once, and then you can slide right or left to change all of these values at once. The advantage of this is that if you create a ratio, you can have, for example, here 2 values, and then you can slide right or left to change all of these values at once. The advantage of this is that if you create a ratio, you can have, for example, here 2 values, and then you can slide right or left to change all of these values at once. The advantage of this is that if you create a ratio, between two sliders or between two values, and you do the same. So you click and drag down and shift, it will keep the ratio but change both of them at once. It's very useful. And now, since I don't know which version, but at least 4.2 from what I remember, if you backspace into a value, it will reset to the set default, which can be very useful when you don't really know what you did to mess up. You can just restart and have a fresh values. So we saw all of the basic settings that were existing in DrawTerrain 1, except the angle X and Y. Now let's go to the new features of the modifier, which are the displacement and the use. So you may have seen me in working with DrawTerrain 2 and teasing how cool you can get displacement looking terrain with maps I created in Gaia. So there's two ways to work with this. You can do it in the shader editor with the node groups I've shown earlier. Let me show them with any of these. So if I import, for example, the Rocky, here you have the displacement and you can choose which displacement map. And you can also have them directly in the geometry, which is very useful if you want to instance object on the plane, because displacement in the shader is gonna visually change the geometry, but if you scatter vegetation on the mesh, it might not look like it's on the plane. Let me show you. If I just add the displacement here and go in EV, you need to activate the displacement and bump if you want to see any displacement. And in EV, since 4.2, you can see displacement directly in there. So here it is. You can see the displacement. You see the orange outline is the actual geometry, and you can see here that we are not following this anymore. So the vegetation would be floating above the terrain. So it's perfect for background assets because you can have very good details, but it's better to have real geometry if you want to scatter elements on them. So for that, you need to choose one of the splat map here, but before they appear here, you need to import one of these node group or one of these splat map into your blend file. So for example, here I imported the Rocky node group here, but if I import the splat map of the Alpines, now I have the Alpines and the Rocky available here. So I can choose, for example, Alpine 4. And now you see that my terrain is not just following the curve, it's being displaced by the map. And don't be afraid to go strong with the values because we are working with large scale terrains, and the way it works, it's depending on the scale. But this is more heavily dependent on the amount of geometry you have to show the amount of details. So the subdivision threshold is very important. So in this case, you need to push it up a bit to have the higher resolution going lower, and then adding more subdivision will give you more detail from the map. They are all 4K optimized, so they are supposed to give you a lot of details. But if you want to have that level of fidelity, be aware that level 7 of subdivision is gonna make the terrain not responsive. So find a middle ground that gives you enough detail here, and then in the shader, we could use, for example, at this time, the splat map to the displacement height. And now we are going to add, I need to go back into the preview. And now we are going to add the actual fine details of the displacement on top. We just need to have the same map. You don't need to have the same if you want to mix them up. It can give you interesting results, of course. If you have the same, those details are going to match now. Just be careful to not push too hard, otherwise the mesh is going to intersect itself. If you use this node group, it has two entries, displacement and bump only. Maybe in the future I might rename them, I'm not too sure yet, but basically displacement and bump, the advantage is that it is going to displace only in the vertical axis, and this avoids the effect that you can have like this when it becomes like a blob, like at the top, and then it starts to intersect itself. Here it is going to push up and down. So it reduces, the effect looks less strong, but you can still push it as much as you want. So here you have the strength, if we just go back here. And you can also control the map length scale, which basically allows you to tile the texture on the length of the curve. So if you draw really long curves and it starts to look stretched, you can increase the tiling basically to fix the scale. Or if you want to just stretch it and deform your terrain, you're free to do whatever you want. The two features in utility, the UV length does kind of the same as the map length scale, but its purpose is to fix the UVs when something like this happens. Basically because the curve is stopping mid-air, so you can see the last point is here, and the calculation tries to fill in the gap, but it's not enough here. So I did this so you can push further the way the UVs are calculated, and then it's gonna help the transition. And you can also stretch it on the width to help the different types of look you could want. It's gonna give you probably weird results, but it's worth trying. Before going into the presets and this node group more in detail, I will show you the AutoTerrain PBR because it will allow us to explore some concepts. So this node group is the basis of what makes the other one work as well. And it is separated in 5 layers, A, B, C, D, E, and these ones are information map that come from geometry node, from this node group, so you don't need to touch it and you should not remove them. Your base layer is basically the grass in general, or what is affected on the terrain that is not a steeped area, and by default I put it green just to help stand a bit. The B are usually the rocks because they are calculated based on the slope, which you can control here, so you have the minimum and the maximum. The closer you get them, the harsher you're gonna have as a transition. And the trick I was telling you earlier is very useful here. When you click and drag, and once you have your ratio, you can just determine the amount of rock you want. And this is automatically calculated based on DrawTerrain, so that's why it's an AutoTerrain shader. A bit like what your Unreal Engine has and the way it works. You have all of the base colors, metallic, roughness, normal, and height. I exposed the values in case you want to input them manually, but I'm guessing that most of the time you will work with textures. But if, for example, you only want to work with the color, at least you can change the roughness. So it's exactly the same on all of the layers. The only exception is each layer has a special feature. Here is the slope. The ground is the way it's affecting the spread and the influence of the curve. The ground only is very useful to blend your terrain with the ground. The snow is the height. So if I lower the height and the max, you can see the snow appearing on top of the other layers, and then you can control the snow amount, the snow height, and the snow height actually displaces the terrain. The snow amount takes in account the slope min and max here, but the more you add, the more it will take over the slope and eventually cover everything. You have the basic control as roughness, detail. If you want to have a snow that looks more graphical, you can remove most of the details. Or something that is supposed to be very big, you can add a lot of details to add fine visual noise. And you can control the size of the noise. Every layer has a mask except the base, of course. And what you can do to work with it is add an image texture, create a random one. For example, I want a mask from the B, so it will be B mask, for example. It can be named anything you want. You can plug it in the mask here, let it recalculate. Go in texture paint mode. Here I have a bunch of custom maps. And now I can start painting a mask where I want the rock to overcome the layer below. So you can even customize the procedural aspect like this. Same for the ground only and the snow. This is the basic of this node group. It seems big and intimidating at first, but I tried to organize it so it's consistent and then it's easy to recognize once you get used to it. So there are separators for the PBR inputs and then the special inputs, and it's always organized the same way. You can deactivate any layer except the base one, of course. So if I remove this shader and now I come and take one of the presets, it's actually a node group, so you just need to import it in your material. Don't forget to put it in displacement and bump. And the only thing you need to plug is the color and roughness. This time I will reduce the adaptive subdivision and remove the displacement from the modifier and add the one from the node group. Eevee is slower to compile shader now since 4.2, but they are working on it. And here it is. I didn't do anything except plugging these three here. A trick I like to do to add more realism is add a map range. Plug the roughness here, invert my values by inverting the ones to min and max and put to max 0.1. That's kind of a default that I do. And I put this in the IOR level. You can see it brings back some of the vibrancy and give a more matte look, which helps for very large scale terrain that are not supposed to be shiny and reflective like that, because there's so much micro detail bouncing light around, there's no specularity happening. So with this you have a very good look without doing anything. So this node group, they are all constructed exactly the same way. The only difference is the name here. So by changing the ID of the map, you change the look of your terrain. Here the displacement scale is gonna increase the displacement value. Displacement ground attenuation is very useful to avoid having crazy displacement when your curve is too close to the ground. You can disable it, so you can still have this type of crazy looking terrains, but it allows to have more realistic results, where if I extrude this curve and go all the way down, you can see the displacement going towards 0 and then blending with the terrain. As of here, it doesn't. Another control that you have to prevent this type of results is the border height blend. So this is going to blend with the curve influence, and like this you have a displacement that is more coherent with the ground. You can invert the height, but it can give you weird results, but anything is possible. Automatically, when the curve goes below the ground, it is going to invert the height to give you more logical results, but you can still put it back and see what you prefer. So the curve index needs to correspond to the one you have here. So if I change the curve index here, nothing works anymore, but if I match it again, it's working. This to show you that if you have two different modifiers, you can have two different node groups that are mapped on two different curves and then blend your different terrain features. Here you have controls over the gradients, which are basically these ones, these four. But before showing you how they work, I will show you how this node group is structured. So you have access to the roughness as before with the other node group, but you don't have metallic, normal, and all of this because you basically don't really need, as this node group is supposed to be a fast way to get quick and good results. So here you can shift between 10 gradients. You have 10 per gradient style, and see what you prefer, the look that you like the most. Here you can change between each of these gradient style, and here it's the way they are mapped to the terrain, either the erosion, the flow, or the soil. You just need to find the one that you like the most. You can invert the map, and here is where the magic happens, where you can offset the gradients to find the look that you really like. So combining the offset, the style of mapping, and all of the different maps, you have endless possibilities and results. And you can see how dramatically each of them changes the look of your terrain. Oh, I forgot this detail also. It's the same as the one in the modifier. It tiles your texture. And this is affected the same way by these ones. So if you see this type of bugs here, you can basically extend, and then now you're good to go. And you can spread more your map. If I remove the ground, for example, you can see that basically you are spreading the map on the ground, which can really be a good look if you want to. See how now everything looks like one terrain. If I reset everything, now it's contained within the influence of the curve. Let's put this back for now. Another effect that is very useful is the gradient range. When you don't want to have so much contrast and details, you can reduce the range, and basically it's gonna have only few colors from that map appearing, and now you can have more subtle transitions. That's another level of control, and it also, just doing this, changes completely the look of your terrain. So now the rock is the same. You'll find the slope, so you can control how much of the slope will be a rock and how much would be grass, or the layer A, whatever you want it to be. It could be also rock, but a different type. And then you can blend different rocks together. So you have access to the exact same gradients. You can choose the way it's mapped again, and in the map, of course. You have the mask like earlier that behaves exactly the same way, because inside there is exactly the same node group here, but this time everything is used. It's here. But you don't need to go in there. The whole point of this node group is that you don't need to go into nodes at all. The only setup you need is this, and you can have all of these results. So now, if I show you the different settings that you can tweak with the gradients, so you can change the hue, giving you another layer of control, the saturation, the value, and you can add a grunge to your map. So if you happen to have a close-up on your terrain, you start to see the quality of the map showing, so you can add a grunge that will add more grain and give a higher res look to your terrain. If you end up adding assets or anything, it doesn't really matter, but it could be a good way to break the low quality aspect, not low quality, but the limitation of the quality that you can encounter. You can distort the noise, and basically you can see the different effects. So sometimes just adding a bit really makes a difference. And you have separate controls on each of the layers. So now you can see how the soil, which is very digital, can become interesting if you start adding grunge to it. And if the value is clamped to 1000, you can still input another value higher. And on your ground, the ground shares the same map as your base. This is for optimization purposes, is to not overload EV or cycles with too many nodes inside this one. I didn't find another workaround, but in general it gives you enough control. You can still change the style, and you can offset it to make sure it really blends with the one from the upper layer. You have control over a scale, the gradient offset, and you can always find, because the maps are corresponding, a moment where they start blending into each other. And reducing the range often really helps to have something not too contrasty, for example. And then now you have your terrain blending with the ground. You can change the influence to blend it even more on a higher level. And we've seen the snow earlier. So it's based on real scale. So if, for example, the snow height is at this, almost 200, and you start raising your terrain, you will reach a point where the snow is touched, and then your terrain will start to be snowy peak. Let's make it slower so it's easier to figure, and change the rock so we can see better. So here you can see the AutoTerrain in full effect, and everything stays procedural, so you can always change your mind and let's say, no, I don't want the same map alpine, and I just want another one. You can even go beyond that, and if you have imported at least once another of these node groups, for example the Rocky earlier, what you can do, if you don't see here the name, you can right click and show node options, and here change it for the Rocky. It will keep all of the info but replace them with the Rocky. The only thing is that Rocky doesn't have 7 displacement, so you just need to go back within the range. But then you keep exactly the same look and the same colors, you're just changing the height map. And same with the hills, the river, terraces and canyon. So for example, if I import the terrace, now I can transform this into a terrace instead. And here you can see. And then just readjusting the strength, and you can have something more nicer, but keeping the look that you defined before. So this is how easy it is to create a terrain like that. Now, there are limitations. For example, if you start drawing more than one curve and the curve intersect, it works fine like this. You can have them blending, and here if I add this back, it works better, but in the shader it will be a bit harder to make them match and look natural, because there's no info for this part, for example. You just need to be aware that these are two UV maps competing for the space now. So it's just something to keep in mind. Sometimes it's easier to create another, let's say, if I separate this, to duplicate your plane and change the curve influencing, and then now you have the two different planes intersecting perfectly. I can make one go a bit lower to make sure there's no Z fighting. So yeah, just be careful if you start intersecting curves. When you want to draw different ones, you can put your cursor right at the tip here and draw from there. This is one of the good case scenario where it could work most of the time. You can see it kind of blends on both sides, and by adding smooth, maybe you can blend that transition. See here. So I will delete this. Talking about limitation and workaround, I have templates of volcano, and basically they are made with a curve circle. So if you add a Bezier curve circle, scale it up, raise it up, so it will work, but there's something happening in the intersection, and it works best when you put the UV length at -1, and that will remove most of the problem. Now, let's see the presets and how to import them. For this, it's very easy. You just choose a category, you drag and drop your preset, and here you have it. You have the DrawTerrain set up the way it was intended in the preset, but you can always tweak it to your own purpose and your own design. Everything is procedural. And you have the setup that I've shown you earlier, the exact same way, but everything is still adaptable. So you have an amazing starting point that is procedural. and still follows a curve that you can draw, of course. They are all quite large. For example, if I had my tiny dude here, you can see it's a very large terrain, but you can see the effect it has. Feel free to just scale it down, and now you have a smaller scale terrain. And then because some areas are probably less steep, you can increase the displacement, change the slope. If you scale your terrain and you decide to apply the transforms, the spread is going to be corresponding to a spread for a large terrain. Let me show you. If I apply the scale here, now the spread is way bigger, so you will need to adjust it to fit what you had. So that's why it's either better to start from a terrain that has the right scale, or do this very early before you start tweaking and being happy with your terrain and then having to do this once again. The curve scale doesn't really affect. You can apply the scale. It does change slightly, but it's not major. Be aware that if you scale a curve, the scale ratio is transferred into the radius, so it's better to put it back to 1. There's a feature that I forgot to mention earlier, is that if you scale the radius of a point with either Alt S or here, it's gonna scale the terrain close to that curve, that point. So if I subdivide this, for example, I will make it more obvious. So if I have a smaller terrain and I increase the radius, you can control the size and the width of your terrain like this and have variable scale, which can be very useful if you want fine control. I will show you the PBR terrains presets. They are smaller because they are also very handy for close-up. So if I have my tiny dude here, having a PBR map helps have very good. And here by default they have subdivision on adaptive. So make sure that you work on EV and experimental to benefit this feature. Otherwise what I might do is disable it by default and then you can enable it so you don't have surprises. But thanks to the displacement of these maps that are from Polyhaven, you can have very, very crisp result and very highly detailed terrains that follow your curve and are still procedural. This is based on the PBR AutoTerrain that I've shown you earlier. And this time, instead of using the UVs from the curves, which is here, I am just using regular object map. Here I have my sets of maps. I just like to group them like this because it's way cleaner. One sort of requirement when working with the PBR mixing is to be in displacement only and not in displacement and bump. Because one of the problems is that every displacement from the maps is gonna make the calculation of the rock layer think that it is a rock layer. There is a height to be taken in account. So here you can see it starts showing up in the foreground and everywhere. But if I put it on displacement only, here I have a clear distinction between the rock areas and the grass. The snow still works the same way, of course. And here if I increase the height, you can start seeing displacing, which is pretty cool. Increase the amount. So that's how the PBR setups are made and how I use them. In these ones there is an extra layer that doesn't appear in the node group presets or in any of these, because I think it's just overkill and it's to make your life easier to use with these node groups. But here you have one that if you activate won't show unless you start painting on it. So you need to add an image texture like I've shown you earlier, and then you can start painting it in. If you want to bake any of these informations to the plain regular UVs, you can do it the normal way, adding an image texture and then an emission shader, selecting the emission, and then selecting the image texture and doing all of the baking that you need to do by using either the baking features built in Blender or using add-ons if you have. And that's why I added the splat maps here, because if you work with one of the presets, let's bring this one in, I really like this one. Here, if you want to bake this information, so you have the color, you can have the roughness, but with the splat map that you can import, you can have access to the height map. So if you see preview it from the top. So here if I see from the top, this is from the UVs. And if I remove, this is the UV generated by the curve. So this is just to create the details from that mesh like this. So this is what's created by these outputs. There is the erosion, that is basically this one, color erosion, the flow, the soil, and the elevation, which is the actual displacement of this terrain as it is right now. So you could export the displacement of this terrain and apply it to a regular plane, and you would get that result again. You'll get this result again. You can activate or deactivate the mask from the curve influence, and you can invert the maps for some reason, because it can be used for baking, but they can be used for extra texturing, for example. If you are doing this, you could use this to have rivers going down, for example, or lava. That's how I used it for one of the volcano setup. You can add the same grunge as earlier, and here for the elevation, it's a sort of clamping if you want to have a height mask, for example. So if you put 1, there is no clamping, and then here you start to change the values and shift them towards the height of your terrain. So you can see 300 is around here actually. But the preview here is not great because values higher than 1 will show white, but they are way more. Here it is like 1,400 here, because here is 0 and here we are going in the minus, but it's not showing colors for the minus. So if you want an accurate baking of your elevation, you need to put it back to 1. In the utilities, it's nodes that I use internally. I've just saved them here if you want to recreate more complex node groups. Mainly this one, which it's the same as the AutoTerrain but deconstructed. So here you have all of the gradients. For example, I can plug one of the gradients in the color. Here you need to choose which of the splat map you want to use. So you need to plug splat map and the alpha in there. So all of this is what's happening under the hood with the other node groups. And here you have sort of the same result as earlier, but with separated nodes, so you can go way more complex now if you want. I wanted to show a bit some result you can have when you step away from the presets, and the cool effect you can have when you just start experimenting with DrawTerrain. In this scene, I have a way simpler shader going on compared to the presets. I am basically only using the splat map as a start, the displacement and bump that is used in these node groups, and one of the gradient map. So you can see by now that this is a deconstructed version of the node groups that we've been exploring and using before, but you can still get very cool results. And because you're not restricted by the node group itself, you can experiment and see the results you can have. Here, for example, I have a curve, and instead of having the height map to drive the displacement, I am using the soil. If I plug, for example, the erosion, I will get a result completely different. But because they all follow the same simulation from Gaia, whatever you plug will feel logical because it's meant to behave from the same simulation. And here I brought the rock gradient, and I can still change the colors. Everything is still procedural, and can experiment endlessly with all of these. Change the offset, can change the hue, the saturation, the grunge, everything. Here I have the normal and the normal displacement, and remove the displacement ground attenuation. And for these ones, let me hide these fog planes. That's the geometry for them, and the settings are very normal. I just have a very low curvature and a bit of a top plateau. The point is just to drive up some of the details and give that sort of eroded, bulbous, mushroom-like features a bit. And I'm using another map from the Rocky, and this time I am mixing 2 different maps that have one in erosion and one in soil, which helps me having these tiny details of color. If I put this to 0, you can see now it's just a simple color, like the ground, but I wanted to have extra details for this, so I added these details of colors. And you can change the blending mode, and you will have completely different effect again, which is really fun to experiment with. If I change the style of rock, I'm gonna get another result each time. I could even increase the map length scale to have more skewed effects like that, which looks pretty cool. And because I have those sort of pointy structures, it's a great opportunity also to try the angle, and you can create a completely different look to your terrain and different effects. You can do the same with the ones in the back. You could also select both of the terrain, press Alt, and then it will change the 2 of them at the same time. So I just wanted to show how with a few nodes and by experimenting a bit, you can have completely different results and really have fun with it. So here it is, that was the tutorial for DrawTerrain version 2. I hope you have fun with it. I've been doing some of these exploration and improvisation in the past few days, and they just take me between 10 to 30 minutes depending on the ideas I found. I wasn't going for anything in particular, just going with the flow. But yeah, here are some of the ones I've done without going too crazy, but just having fun. But now it's your turn. I hope you have fun with it. Feel free to join my Discord if you have any questions related to Blender in general, DrawTerrain or anything. And looking forward to seeing what you're gonna make with it.